Alright, so I'm sure I'm a little bit late to the party with this guide, but there's a lot to learn about King Arthur, and I wanted to make sure I played him enough to learn most of what there is to learn about him before jumping into a god guide. But as decided by my patrons in a poll, the one true king himself is the next guide, so let's dive right into it. So as always, I'll start by covering Arthur's basic playstyle and what he's all about, then I'll cover all of his abilities in depth and synergies between them. After that, items and builds, where I'll explain the way I build Arthur and why, plus a full build example. And finally, we'll round off the guide with some tips and tricks to up your game on the one true king. Alright, so let's dive right into this with Arthur's basic overview. So Arthur plays quite differently to a lot of gods. He's all about high speed, almost spammy sort of gameplay. Since he is a stance switcher, he has access to 8 abilities, so being able to utilise all of them quickly will yield the best results. Being a warrior, he works best as a tanky frontliner, and thus, at least in my opinion, he is only viable as a solo laner right now at a high level. Okay, so given he has 8 of them and a large passive to cover, let's move on to Arthur's abilities in depth. So even in his passive alone, there's a lot to unpack with this god, with multiple components doing different things. So the main function of this passive is that every time you hit an enemy god with an ability, you gain a stack of steadfast, which gives you damage reduction and bonus energy gain, which will cover what you use energy for later on. At the stack limit of 4 stacks, you get 6% mitigation and double energy gain. Then the rest of this passive is just explaining a few things with Arthur that work differently from other gods. So Arthur is of course a stance switcher, and the way he changes stance is simply by casting an ability, after which he gets one ability in the opposite stance and goes back to normal, etc. So you essentially alternate between regular and combo abilities with him, but the ultimate doesn't trigger this is just for his 3 regular abilities. Also, Arthur's abilities are all locked to instant cast, so there's no like setting the targeter and then clicking or anything like that. It's just as soon as you hit the button it will cast the ability. And he also doesn't benefit from attack speed increases. Generally, you're not looking to buy attack speed on ability-based warriors like King Arthur anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. But similar to Cuchulainn, any attack speed you do end up buying gives you a small increase to your energy gain. So yeah, once you know what this passive does, it's not that hard to manage. You're always going to be hitting enemies with abilities, so stacking up steadfast is pretty easy. The free 6% damage mitigation and double energy gain is extremely powerful though, as we'll cover later on. Okay, so on to Arthur's first ability. This is where his stance switch mechanic comes in. In standard stance, it's overhead slash, and in combo stance, it's hamstring. So overhead slash is fairly simple. It's just a line damage ability that does bonus damage to anyone within melee range. This is sort of a theme with Arthur and his general abilities. They're quite simple, it's the way you use them and like the stance switch mechanic where his complexity comes into the mix. And hamstring simply slashes all enemies in a large cone in front of Arthur, doing damage and crippling all enemies hit for 1.25 seconds. So this ability is Arthur's main early damage tool. Both of these abilities do very high damage when you rank them up, and are your main wave clear and poking tool in lane. The cripple on hamstring is very quick to activate, and so it's quite useful against certain gods that rely on movement. It's especially powerful in the mirror match since 3 of King Arthur's abilities are all countered by cripples, and you can stop his combo stance 3 in the middle of the cast. Okay, onto Arthur's 2, Battle Stomp in standard and Uppercut in combo stance. So Battle Stomp is incredibly simple. You just stomp the ground and do a small amount of damage and slow all enemies hit in a small AoE around yourself. Uppercut is a very short dash that ends in a knock up and does a bit more damage than Battle Stomp. You either knock up at the maximum range, or if you hit an enemy god during the dash, you'll stop the dash early and knock them up. So this ability is Arthur's main form of CC outside of his ultimate, and it's best used that way. The damage on both abilities here is quite low, but the knock up and heavy slow are really useful when boxing and or chasing people down. Another way I like to use these is as like quick combo switches, since they have super short animations and will switch your stance really quickly. So for example, if you're in standard stance but you need access to hamstring for the cripple, you can quickly battle stomp and then use hamstring right afterwards. Okay, Arthur's third ability is Twin Cleave or Blade Storm. For Twin Cleave, you dash forward, cleaving with your sword twice in the duration, doing damage and shredding enemy protections with each hit. And for Blade Storm, you spin around, but this time dealing tick damage around you up to 5 times before ending the ability in a larger swing that does bonus damage. So I mentioned cripples before. This ability is mainly where that comes in. Both of these abilities count as dashes, so anyone with an on-demand cripple can really mess up your plays when using these. Naturally, since they give extra movement, these abilities are great for chasing. The damage on Twin Cleave is pretty mediocre, but once you get a few points into Blade Storm, if you can keep enemies in the damage for the full duration, it can really chunk people. Alright, so finally let's cover Arthur's ultimates, Sundering Strike or Excalibur's Wrath. So right off the bat, before we dive into the abilities themselves, which ultimate you get is tied to your energy level, not to your current stance. So if you wanted to use Excalibur's Wrath in standard stance, you can, you just need enough energy for it. As I mentioned before, the passive can up to double your energy gain, and the way you gain energy is by hitting enemies with your other abilities. So the 1 gives 3 energy, the 2 gives 4, and the 3 gives 2. But with the 3 that is per tick of damage, so usually it will be more than 2 energy. Plus if you're doubling energy gain with a passive, you can generate enough energy to ult pretty quickly in a fight. So if you're at or above 35 energy, you can use Sundering Strike. which is a pretty long range jab attack that does decent damage and stuns all enemies in a line for 1 second. And if you're at or above 80 energy, you can use Excalibur's Wrath, which is a line dash, and if you hit an enemy god, you throw them into the air, similar to a Najar ultimate, and hit the enemy 6 times, before knocking them back to the ground in a final blow that does additional damage. Excalibur's Wrath does normal physical damage, but also percentage max health true damage on each hit. So both of these ultimates are super powerful, and which one you should be aiming to use depends on the situation really. Usually in a 1v1 scenario like the laning phase, you're better off waiting for Excalibur's Wrath, but in teamfights you're usually better off going for a multi-man stun with Sundering Strike since it is much faster to charge. But really which one you want to use really does depend on the situation, and you have to evaluate what you need for the situation basically. And as I mentioned, Excalibur's Wrath does max health true damage, so it is still going to chunk tanks pretty hard even when they have a lot of defense. Both these ultimates only have a 20-second cooldown, so it's realistic to get multiple ults off in a fight. The only thing holding you back really is how fast you can build energy, so if you're sat on full energy, you should probably just use the ult to begin charging for a second one, unless you absolutely need to save it for like securing a kill or something. And one final note, once you tick over to level 5 in lane, you'll almost certainly have Excalibur's Wrath available immediately, since you spend the last 5 levels gaining energy, so you can make plays based on knowing that you will have the full charged ult ready at level 5. Alright, so let's quickly cover a level order for King Arthur before we move on to items and builds. So level 1, you want the 1. This gives you the fastest wave clear and totem pressure early on, and it's also the best poke and early boxing tool. Level 2, I generally prefer to go into the 2. Some people like the 3, but for me the damage on both abilities here is just too low in the 3 to warrant getting it at level 2. Going into the 2 gives you that bit of extra CC and boxing potential, and that's what I prefer to use. Level 3, generally I like to grab the 3 just to finish off and have all 6 abilities available to me, but it's not terrible to grab a second point in the 1 here either for a little bit of extra burst damage. Then from there you want to max the 1 first, then the 3, then the 2, taking points in the ultimate whenever you can. I've also been experimenting with skipping points into the ultimate and just going straight into the 3 after the 1, but for me personally it seems like leveling the ult is better. But of course you can try out skipping the ultimate and going into the 3, I think that's also somewhat viable. Okay, with abilities and leveling done, let's move on to Arthur's item choices and a build example. So being an ability based warrior with 8 abilities, cooldown reduction is Arthur's best friend. Ideally you want to be aiming for high CDR in every Arthur build. Usually 30% is the sweet spot to allow you to get other stats as well, and you can get the other 10% through blue buff if you need it. So in terms of starting builds for Arthur in solo, personally I do like to start Warrior's Blessing on him this season. The mana sustain it gives is really important for Arthur early on in lane, and the damage reduction is also really good since you'll often be tanking minion waves with him in lane because you'll be hitting enemy gods with your abilities a lot, and having that damage reduction from each minion hit is really powerful. Then usually I like to grab a health chalice and 3 health potions. This gives you a ton of sustain throughout the early laning phase to box and contest totem, and also some additional sustain throughout the rest of the laning phase because of the chalice. You could also start an item like Round Shield or Tier 1 boots here, but personally I prefer the extra potions. Speaking of boots, for Arthur I like Warrior Tabai. With the sheer amount of abilities he has, one rotation of his kit is actually a lot of power scaling, so the 40 power is put to good use here. But reinforced greaves are also an option if you like to play the early game very defensive. From there, Gladiator Shield should almost always be your first item, especially against physical lane opponents. Given Arthur can spam 6 abilities very quickly, that's 6 Gladiator Shield procs at 2.5% of your max health and mana. So 15% of your max health and mana back, just from one rotation of your kit, is extremely powerful. This item alone can make Arthur near immortal given how much you can proc its effect. Plus, given his low mana cost per ability, the Glad Shield often pays for most of the mana you use to cast the ability in the first place. This item should be in every Arthur build and only be sold if the enemy counters it with severe anti-heal. Otherwise, just run free healing for 150 every ability. From there, against magical laners, I like either Pestilence or Genji's Guard based on if they have significant healing or not. So against like a Hell or a Hades for example, I would grab the anti-heal, but otherwise get Genji's Guard for the extra CDR and mana sustain that it provides. Against a physical, my go-to is Void Shield, but I also kinda like Breastplate as well. With Breastplate though, you gotta watch your CDR since you don't want to overcap later in the build, and Gladiator Shield plus Breastplate is already 30%. Void Shield is super good since mostly with Arthur you're working off a lot of high base damage abilities, so the 20 pen goes a long way to increasing your damage. Plus it provides actually pretty respectable defenses since it combines protections with health in a single item. But as I mentioned, Breastplate is still a good, more defensive option for physicals, you've just got to watch your CDR with it. So from there you're going to be looking to counter build the enemy team, finish up your CDR and get tanky for team fights. Here are a few items I like to finish off of my builds with as Arthur. Hide of the Urchin, Spirit Robe and Mantle of Discord are all items that you can't really go wrong with. Just be careful with Urchin since if you are getting bodied in lane you probably won't have time to stack it up. But if you're even or ahead, Urchin provides so much defense in a single item that I think it's really great on Arthur. Spirit Robe and Mantle are both great as well in almost any situation really, but once again be careful with overcapping CDR. If you build breastplate early on and then you finish up these, that's already a 40% CDR done, so just be careful with these. A lot of items that are good on Arthur have CDR, but you can only get 40%. That's why I like the items like Urchin and Void Shield, because they don't interfere with your CDR options. Blackthorn Hammer is a nice early rush item for Arthur, especially in combination with Gladiator Shield, since the heal is percentage based on Glads and the mana from Blackthorn means you can spam abilities all day long. I generally like this item earlier rather than later though. I think after sort of like third item it's not really worth getting anymore. If you desperately need more magical defense, if they have like a triple or quad magical team, Talisman of Energy isn't half bad if you can't fit in a Genji's or a Pestilence into your build. I usually prefer those two though. You can also go with Anchile or Runic Shield for a more aggressive anti-mage option with some power. And the typical counter items for warriors apply to Arthur of course. So Midgardian Mail and or Hide of the Nemean line for countering enemy hunters and assassins like Mercury or Kali. Pestilence, as I've mentioned earlier, is your go-to counter for healers. Winged Blade is really nice on Arthur if they have a heavy slow composition, since he relies a lot on movement to be successful and having that immunity can be really powerful. So I generally don't like too much damage on Arthur, since he works best with just like high CDR working off of base damages and his mobility plus Gladiator Shield heals to stay in the fight. But if you are itching for some damage in your build other than a Void Shield, I like Masamune. It gives you that bit of extra speed which is always nice, plus some health and defenses mixed in with the power. And generally Arthur likes being in the thick of the fight hitting multiple people, so he gets a lot of use out of Masamune's passive effect. Okay, and finally I'll quickly cover relic options before we get into a full build example. So your first relic should always be teleport. Having that instant way back to lane if you get poked out or need to back for an item keeps you from missing farm and can be a really nice fallback. For second slot, generally I pick from the three typical teamfight relics of Shell, Heavenly Wings and Horrific Emblem. But I think Blink can also work to a certain extent on Arthur, though it is something I'm still trying out. Okay, so those are the items I'm generally considering for my builds in-game. Let's get into that full build example for solo lane Arthur. Start with Warrior's Blessing, Chalice of Healing, 3 health potions and teleport. Then grab Gladiator's Shield, Warrior Tabai, Void Shield, Hide of the Urchin, Spirit Robe, Mantle of Discord, and if the game goes late enough, sell your boots for Masamune and get the Elixir of Speed, with your second relic being Shell. In my opinion, Glad Shield is so OP on Arthur that it's even worth keeping into the late game unless the enemy builds severe anti-heal against you. And if you're landing against a magical opponent in solo, you should swap out the Void Shield in third slot for either Genji's Guard or Pestilence. Okay, so with abilities and builds done, let's round out this guide with some Arthur tips and tricks to up your game. So there's actually a lot of cool tricks you can do that are unique to Arthur, so this section should be pretty useful. So one of those things being unique to Arthur are his lunge auto attacks. The small dash he gets when using these is not affected by cripples, roots, and other things that limit movement. So you can do some pretty interesting stuff, like if a Poseidon goes to Whirlpool Kraken you can't dash out of the cripple with your abilities, but if you're close enough to the edge, you can use your auto attacks for that bit of extra distance to dodge out of the area. Another thing to note with his autos is that if you don't want to activate the lunge for whatever reason, maybe you're finishing off some minions that are under the enemy tower or whatever, you can just tap walk backwards for a split second as you use the auto attacks and it won't lunge. It takes a bit of experience to get the timing down on this one, and I have auto attacked myself under towers numerous times trying to do it, but it can be useful sometimes. Oh, and one more thing on his auto attacks. There's actually a lot of unique stuff you can do with these boys. Whenever you're going to cast a movement ability, you can auto attack for the lunge and then cancel the animation straight into an ability. This is best with his dashes, but it can be done with any of his abilities, including the ultimates, to get some extra range. It's very useful for chasing down kills, running away, or if you're coming out of spawn to get back to lane quicker. Following on from the auto attack stuff, movement is King Arthur's most powerful asset. The constant lunges plus 3 dashes and another dash on the full charged ultimate means you can outmaneuver most gods, and weaving yourself into and out of the backline while healing constantly from Glad Shield can cause huge problems for the enemy team. And if you're building just a little bit of damage, they can't really just ignore you. And if they go to focus you down, it's likely going to take them a long time, which opens up space and opportunities for your team to follow up. And finally, don't be afraid to use your ultimates. They only have a 20-second cooldown, so as long as you're fighting, you can quickly gain the energy back and be ready to ult again. Being able to small ult 3 times in a fight will be better than one big one usually, but often you can engage with a small ultimate, then charge up for a big one while the small one is on cooldown. Use that, and then by the time you get back to 35 energy again, the small ult is back off cooldown and you can use it again. So yeah, don't be afraid to ult even if it's not going to instantly result in a kill. Alright, so that's all I have for the One True King. Go forth and conquer solo lane. But before you do, drop a like on the video and suggest who you want to see next in the guides. These take a lot of work to produce, so any feedback is greatly appreciated, but anyways, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out, you nerds.